It is 9:30 on Sunday morning. There's no better place to be than at office hours. This is week 4, 3, 2, some week in Lent. As we continue on this Lenten journey, this wilderness that has lasted for many of us about a year ago. So, we're getting used to it. 40 more years and we'll be like the Israelites. But my name is Chris Holmes. I'm the scholar and resident at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I'm joined by Dr. Brennan Breed, who is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. And we are joined today by Dr. Matthew Thiessen, who teaches teaches New Testament. I knew I was going to make a mistake, Brennan.
He teaches everything. He teaches the Bible. Come on now. He can do it all.
He teaches everything. That's right.
I'll be honest here. I'm going to break in. Dr. Matt Thiessen is one of the few New Testament scholars who I would trust to teach an Old Testament class. I'll say that.
No pressure.
Wow.
No, because what we'll talk about today, there's a lot that he draws from the Old Testament in a very constructive way. So let's say he just teaches all Bible.
He teaches all Bible, and I want all of our viewers to note that Brennan has never expressed such confidence in me regarding the Old Testament, and those that have been in class with me teaching Old Testament know why he doesn't express that confidence.
And no one should express the confidence in me in the New Testament. So that's why we have both of us here. But in any event, yes. But thank you so much for joining us, Matt. Matt joining us all the way from Canada. So this is a cross-cultural encounter here, across an international experience. But thank you so much for taking the time. Of course, this is sort of replacing in some way or helping people increase their Christian education during the time of COVID. So thanks for joining us and helping us with this. This is part of our larger Lenten study, where we're talking about Jesus and the forces of evil and the forces of death and the cross, and trying to understand in a slightly different way what the cross is and how it works. Not that we're going to replace or take away all talk of substitutionary atonement, which we see in the New Testament, we see in the works, it's the letters of Paul and somewhat, but there's also so much more to the story of Jesus and Jesus' death and resurrection. So thinking about Jesus and the forces of death, which by the way is Matt's new book, which we recommend heartily. This study, Matt, is like we said, rich and deep and encounters both Old Testament and New Testament. But maybe we can ask you just to kick it off. We generally ask guests to share some presuppositions or just some kind of guiding principles or some things they're interested in studying the biblical text. What lenses do you bring to the table that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, a number of different lenses. One lens that I bring, and probably the most prominent lens I bring, is the effort to read the New Testament texts and Jesus and Paul within ancient Judaism, not against ancient Judaism, but within it. And so trying to understand how they're grappling with Jewish scriptures, with sacred texts and traditions and rituals in ways that make sense within their cultural world, even if they don't make sense to our cultural world. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the main lens.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, and that I think that's something that we oftentimes we jump over that gap too easily sometimes, right? We imagine that like concepts, and we'll talk about this some today. Like if we read like love in the Old Testament or something, we're like, well, I know that. I know what love is, right? Like I Valentine's Day and whatever, a fancy dinner or something, but those concepts might mean something really different in, let's say, an ancient context, and the only way we can figure out what those things mean is to really try to think about them in context and take off some of our presuppositions. So thanks again for talking to us about your newest book, Jesus and the Forces of Death. But do you have a new project that you're working on or anything else that you'd like to point us to that we can be on the lookout for?
Yeah, apart from some smaller things, I'm actually right now trying to write a very popular level book on the Apostle Paul that takes up some work I've done previously, but makes it more accessible to a broad readership of, interested readers, whether that's undergrads or lay people or clergy, trying to, again, read Paul sort of within the world of ancient Judaism, not against it as is so commonly done.
And this would be, in a way, developing work that you've already done in Paul and the Gentile problem?
That's right. Yeah. So,
can you give us
I always try to write for everybody, but I think scholars often overestimate our ability to do that. And I'm really trying to write something that's like actually pleasant for people to read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give us a nutshell argument? Like what is Paul and the Gentile problem about?
Yeah. So, when readers come across Paul, it's so easy to think these are letters written for the whole world. That's how we read the Bible as Christians. And it's not wrong. But if we jump over the gap again, that historical gap, and forget that Paul, when he's writing, he's actually really addressing almost exclusively, maybe exclusively, depending on who you ask, non-Jews. And so what he has to say specifically relates to non-Jews. That doesn't mean he thinks this Jesus message isn't for Jews, but the way he's talking about it in his letters, the rhetorical sort of edge to it is addressed to non-Jews who are thinking about adopting the Jewish law. And he's trying to convince them, no, what you get in Jesus the Messiah is all you need, and you need it as Gentiles. You don't need to become Jews to do this.
Yeah, and so yeah.
I was gonna ask if, as maybe a point of transition into our topic this morning, one of the things that I think is pretty standard thought among Christians, particularly contemporary Christians, but even very early Christians, probably as early as the 2nd century, is that Jesus came, and because Jesus came, he basically stopped caring about purity, right? Like that's all of this stuff in the Old Testament about purity and impurity, that's just all been replaced, right? I mean, Jesus showed up and he's clearly not concerned about it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's the common take. Either that he comes and says, now this is old, it's obsolete, it's done, or it was always, superstition, silly superstition, and you never should have been paying attention to this. Who cares about, some skin condition or a bit of blood? It's about the interior. That's the common message I think that Christians take when they read the Gospels. And, the Gospel stories Jesus encounters, this is something I sort of realized on my own. I'm sure others had well before me. When I was doing my PhD, I realized there are 3 sources of ritual impurity in Leviticus or in Numbers, 3 sort of categories. In the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have Jesus interacting with people from each category, sometimes multiple times. And what you don't get there is Jesus saying, don't worry about it. It's just a little flaky skin. You're golden. We get something very, very different. We get Jesus actually addressing these impurities themselves as though they're real and as though they matter.
Yeah, and I think that interacts with kind of a larger issue with Christians in the Old Testament, which is that a lot of Christians believe that the New Testament does away with the Old Testament, or does away with, the laws especially, right? So we don't have to follow the Torah or anything like that. The authors of the New Testament, in your opinion, would have us believe something different, right? That is that it's not that Jesus comes and tells us that the laws were ridiculous and that we don't need to follow them anymore. This is, by the way, associated with centuries, millennia of anti-Judaism within Christianity, and anti-Jewish polemic and violence that emerges from that. So there's some real, actual problems that emerge from this, physical, material problems that emerge from these ideas, which you've pointed out as well. But so what's the problem with that idea? Jesus came to do away with the Mosaic law, or especially the priestly stuff like Leviticus. Who reads that? Who cares about that, right? Jesus came to tell us that Leviticus doesn't matter anymore, right?
Yeah. As you noted, Brennan, I think, first of all, and this is another lens I bring to the text, and it's more of a theological one, is my concern about Christian supersessionism and Christian anti-Judaism. Those readings of the New Testament, I think, are insidious, and they're very dangerous, and they still have power today. And frankly, I think we're seeing some of that rear its ugly head even more than we've seen in recent decades. But fundamentally, if you look at the Gospels and read them, the first story, so if I can just jump in here to Mark 1, the first story we get of Jesus interacting with someone who's ritually impure is Jesus dealing with what Mark calls a lepros, often translated as a leper. And you could get me going for hours about why that's a bad translation. It's not leprosy. It's minor skin condition, closer to something like eczema or dandruff than it is to Hansen's disease, leprosy. This man comes to Jesus, according to Mark, and Matthew and Luke both repeat this story and say, if you want, or if you desire, you can purify me. On a supersessionist reading, Jesus should say, purify you, you're clean already, you're good. Don't worry about your skin condition. That law never made sense, or now it's obsolete. And that's exactly what Jesus doesn't do. And the whole question of the story is, do does Jesus desire to purify someone who's ritually impure? And Jesus's answer is, yes, I desire be pure. And then the man is purified of this condition, this underlying skin condition. And then the icing on the cake here is Jesus doesn't say, good, you're golden, get out of here, go do whatever. He says, now go to the priests and do what Moses required of you for the rest of your purification, sort of residual impurity that lingers after the condition is gone. That's the command. And it's all following Leviticus 13, well, Leviticus 14 in this instance, the cleaning up of the residual impurity. It's a law-observant Jesus, but it's a law-observant Jesus who has a particular power that's not particularly common. He can remove the sources of impurity.
Yeah, and one of the things you point out so well in the book is that, you know, purity gets a pretty bad rap in modern culture for some good reasons, right? People use purity as a weapon to exclude people, keep certain people out of communities and so on. But what you point out is that the Gospels take this idea of purity really seriously, and that there actually are some like within ancient Judaism, there's these there's some core beliefs about purity, and that it's not just like purity for the sake of purity. It has to do with God's presence, and it has to do with death and life, right? These are like kind of core these are like powers or forces that exist in the world. So, I mean, Jesus isn't making this stuff up, and the New Testament isn't making this up. This comes from the Old Testament, as you were pointing out, Leviticus. So what are some of these kind of like, I don't know, core beliefs, or how do they work together in a way?
Yeah. So, Brennan, if you could pop up that sweet little slide that you made.
Oh, yeah. Here we go.
This is actually really helpful, and I should have done it myself. There are 4 categories.
So here's a little slide. Yeah, here we go.
All right, we can all see this?
Yep.
Boom, perfect. There are 4 chief categories in Leviticus. You actually see it in Leviticus 10:10. God says to the priests, your job is to distinguish these categories: pure from impure and holy from common. It is exceedingly common to conflate these categories, that people think pure equals holy and impure equals common, and that's just not the case. There are 4 separate categories, and every single person is either pure or impure, and every single person is either holy or common.
And so you're saying common instead of like unholy, like the opposite of holy isn't like Satan.
Yeah. So the other way it gets translated is profane, which of course in English has a couple of meanings, one of which is like profane language, which is bad language. My kids aren't supposed to use this language. And when they do, I have no idea where they get it from. It's naughty, bad, dirty language. This is not what profane means. It just means common. It's not special, just for regular everyday use. These are the 4 chief categories. And Jacob Milgram, amongst others, have said, look, pure and common are really just states of being. They're really characterized by what they're not, actually. They're the absence of something. Common just means it's not holy, it's not special.
Like, and I'm common, I'm not ordained, I'm just a guy, so right. I'm common. Or like this fidget spinner. This is just common. It's not holy. Holy would mean like something set aside for God's special purpose or something.
Exactly.
Right?
So the temple or the Sabbath or the priests could be described as holy because they're set apart for distinct special use, and it's pertaining to God.
So you can have set aside days, set aside spaces, set aside people, set aside things, like the stuff in the temple, like the menorah is a holy object. Okay, yeah.
And food as well. So objects, space, and time. And then, of course, God is holy. And the source of holiness, Jacob Milgram would argue. So he's the one who invests the temple or the tabernacle with holiness through God's presence. Mm-hmm. What Milgram argues is that holiness actually functions like a force. And he compares this to electromagnetism, which I think can be pretty helpful, especially if you know these laws, unlike me. The laws of electromagnetism, that is. The other thing that functions like a force is impurity. So holiness and impurity are 2 forces that ultimately do not play well together. And so the key to the whole system is to make sure you know whether you're impure or pure, so that if you're impure, you don't go into the wrong space, don't touch the wrong thing, don't approach God in a state of impurity, because if you do, the sort of cultic sparks start to fly. and that could be very dangerous for you because
short
you're
circuit.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
And here, it's the very accurate representation of Indiana Jones. You know, the sparks is that your face is going to melt if you're in the presence of holiness and you're impure, right? I mean, that's completely biblically accurate and 100% in line with Leviticus.
It's totally taken right out of the Bible.
Good,
I mean, it's a joke, but there's also a truth to this. And this is Hannah Harrington has written a really fascinating book recently on this. And one of the things she compares holiness to, and Israel's God to, is radiation. Which, if you've watched Chernobyl, that amazing series Chernobyl, it's absolutely powerful, and it shows you, of course, the dangers of radiation. If you approach radiation the wrong way, you will regret it because you are incapable of standing in its presence improperly.
Nice.
But it's also a really good thing. It can be used for good. It can be used to help cure someone of cancer. It could be used to power large things. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous good. And ultimately, that's who God is in priestly thought. God needs to be approached with absolute care. I've talked about God being a little fussy, being a neat freak. God likes tidiness and order in the mind of the priestly writers. And so keeping God's earthly dwelling clean is essential for you to live well and for God to remain with you. And that's, I should say very, very quickly, I'm sorry, I'm talking at great length here. Benjamin Summer in The Bodies of God has this fantastic comment about that lengthy section at the end of Exodus where God gives Moses all these, to us, super boring details about how to construct the temple. And then it basically repeats all this with Moses doing just as God commanded. Sounds really boring to us, but the whole point is God wants to dwell in proximity to humans. But because of God's sort of needs, his fussiness, it's got to be done just so. And so God is actually, through these rules, trying to set up what modern religious people would talk about, a relationship, a close, intimate relationship with humans. And this whole cultic system is intending to do that. So we see, God's distancing God's self. This is a way of excluding people from God's presence. It's actually not intended that way. Given the cultural assumptions, it's actually meant to enable humans to live closely and as safely as possible with God.
This is great. Yeah. So, I mean, just to point out this, when, the beginning of Exodus 25, people love Exodus 1 through 24. Exodus 25, people stop reading. But like you said, it's a little hard to read, but it's brilliant. But also it starts off, and as Benjamin Summer points out, in Exodus 25, verse 8, the very beginning of this kind of lengthy section of building the tabernacle and the sanctuary, God says, verse 8 of chapter 25 of Exodus, and have them make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. So this is the whole purpose, is God's presence among the people. But what's interesting, you point out, is it Hannah Harrington who talked about nuclear radiation? I mean, it's a brilliant analogy, because like a nuclear power plant, you have to have some fussy people. Because the immense power that is generated and contained and distributed to people that keeps everything working, right? The power of life, we might say, or energy, is also dangerous, because too much of that, or in an unsafe way, will destroy you. Our bodies aren't created to be in the presence of immense nuclear radiation. How much more powerful would God be then than nuclear radiation, right? So you have to have these, if you think about the priests as the nuclear power plant managers who are making sure we don't have a Chernobyl on our hands, right? In a way, is that an analogy that works, you think?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And we read these and see, man, rules. And of course, given Christian discourse, that's a bad thing. But these aren't rules for the sake of rules, just like going to a nuclear power plant isn't, they don't have rules for the sake of rules. They're not trying to impinge upon our freedom. Just to tap into, I think, a pretty prevalent discourse in our world, both in Canada and in the States, unfortunately. Some of these rules, it impinges on our freedom, but that's not the point. It's actually to protect us and to protect others. And that's exactly what Leviticus is up to.
Well, that's cool. So if holiness then is the power of life that kind of originates in God and is like this overwhelming power of life that can even destroy us because it can be too great for us, but can be contained so that God can be present with us and God's generative energy and power can be present with us, then what is impurity?
Yeah. This is, again, I'm dependent upon the work of Jacob Milgram and other Leviticus scholars. Milgram argues, look, so first of all, let me just very briefly say, Milgram distinguishes between two types of impurity. And this is also a common problem in scholars, in pastors, and lay people. There's ritual impurity, or cultic impurity, and moral impurity, sin. And the same word, unfortunately, gets used for both of them, which causes us to conflate the two. Ritual impurity is not sinful. If a woman has a baby, she's ritually impure according to Leviticus 12. Doesn't mean she's sinned. When people have sex, they become ritually impure for one day. No one thinks they've sinned by having sex.
It's a good thing, in other words. Yeah. It generates life or whatever, but that might be the problem too.
Yeah. So moral impurity, let's keep that distinct for a moment. Ritual impurity, Milgram says, look, there are three categories. Lepra, or what we call leprosy, which we've translated as leprosy, genital discharges of blood and semen, and then corpses, which we read about in Numbers 19. Corpses obviously relate, quite clearly to death. Lepra, the skin condition, we hear in Numbers with Miriam, who contracts this as a punishment, for a brief punishment. Aaron describes her as one who looks like a corpse. And you see this in later literature as well. You see Josephus talks about this, and later rabbinic literature talks about this. One who has this condition is somehow equated with death. And genital discharges of blood and semen, this is a little trickier. It might just reference mortality more generally. Only mortals give birth and have children and have sex and these things, but it could also be connected with death in the sense that, birth, again, it comes only from dead people, or people who are going to die, I should say, not from dead people. And also the loss of blood, which is life, and the loss of semen, which is connected to blood, is the loss of life force. So Milgram says impurity actually represents forces of death. Thus the title of my Jesus book.
Yeah, and I think it's Jonathan Clowens who points out too. He has another argument, which is that perhaps like the generation of life, so sex and birth and so on, it's kind of like humans exercising the power of life, which needs to dissipate before you enter into a holy space. That is, you need to recognize that you're not the author of life, God is. And so in that way, then when a woman has a baby, she becomes impure. That's not like a punishment for the woman or something. Right. It's a recognition that women actually are more powerful when it comes to the generation of life or something like that. So I mean, there's the just like we said, ancient contexts don't spell these things out for us. They take them for granted. So we have to kind of suss them out. But in a way, so impurity has to do with the forces of death, which are present in this world, and they're not like accounted for in the Old Testament. That is, that like, as we talked about last week, the priests don't talk much about the forces of death. They just recognize that they exist and that they are in some way like in conflict with God, the author of life and the fountain of life, right? But so then if someone were to walk into a holy space, like the temple, what do they have to do?
Depends who it is and depends where they want to go, of course. There's the courtyard, there's the first room in the tabernacle or temple, and then there's the most holy place. And the closer you get to the most holy place, which is where God's sort of chariot throne is, and where God's presence is most maybe potently present. Nobody thinks God's only in this temple, but this is where God's forces are most potent. The closer you get, the fewer people who can go in and the less frequently one can go in. But you not absolutely, as sort of a base requirement, you have to be in a state of ritual impurity. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, you're introducing impurities into God's dwelling place, and God being a little fussy, requiring cleanliness, requiring purity, it starts to unsettle the cultic equilibrium, to the point that at some point, if it gets bad enough, God actually leaves, which actually the prophet Ezekiel, who's also a priest, depicts God sort of fleeing this overly messy temple because of all the impurities that have been created. And God's just, I like to sometimes use the word, God's allergic to it in a sense, which maybe we don't like that idea of limiting God in that sense, but God just can't abide impurity in close proximity to God's being. So.
And in some way, sacrifice can help that by like kind of using the blood, as we mentioned last week, as kind of a ritual detergent. But overall, like, I mean, there's a limit to how much that can do, right? So if you are a holy person, like a priest, and you are pure, you follow these purity laws, green light, you can go into the temple, and you can even go into like maybe the sanctuary, you know, like the inside part of the temple, right? But what if I'm a common person, I'm not ordained, and I'm impure? Am I sinful? Am I bad? Do I need Jesus to come and heal my sins because of that?
Yeah, not at all. They're actually really simple ways, basically washing in time, water in time, to take an impure person, whether it's a priest or a common person, to take them and purify them. And, you know, it might be a certain time requirement. Sometimes it's just overnight. Sometimes it's 7 days with regard to corpses, for instance. But a time in washing, really minor, generally easy stuff to do. Sometimes, depending on the impurity, you might need to make an offering as well. But you're not sinful. You're only sinful if you take that impurity into the wrong place and you know, sort of intentionally introduce this into holy space. Then you've sort of willfully done something, and that's where the ritual impurity, all of a sudden, moral impurity gets added to that, to your balance there.
So you can't go into the temple if you're impure and common, but like it's not the end of the world. I mean, hopefully you over time will be able to go into the temple, but you're just kind of temporarily banned. But no one's mad at you. But what if you are, let's say, pure and common? Can you go into the temple then? Maybe you
can get into the courtyard, but if you go into holy space, again, you've now caused a problem because you don't belong there as someone who's common.
So you can like enter into the edges of the courtyard. Yeah. Now, what if you are a holy person, like a priest, but you become impure and then you walk into the temple?
Yeah, bad news. So ultimately, you know, Brennan, you mentioned women giving birth, for instance, and I think for a lot of modern readers, look at how this impinges upon women, especially with menstruation. Yeah. You know, generally a monthly thing for most women in giving birth. We see how it impinges on women much more than it does on men. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the priests who are the ones who are experiencing the limitations the most, because they're the ones, especially those working in Jerusalem or in the Tabernacle, they're the ones who are most affected by these regulations, because they're the ones who actually have to be in a state of purity to even go in regularly and do their sort of daily job.
Here, I'm going to stop sharing just so we can see each other. But yeah. Anyway, thanks. So there's the like sacrificial system and the, you know, how the purity and holiness systems and how these ideas work together. So if we can kind of shift for a little bit to the New Testament and think then, so by the time of Jesus, then these skin conditions and uncontrolled blood discharge, death. And then, as you pointed out, there's a new thing that emerges around the time of Jesus, which is the idea of demons and demon possession, which, as we said last week, isn't a concern as much of the Old Testament, probably because they're trying to not get people to worship demons. By the time of Jesus, Israel and the Jewish people are much more inured in monotheism, or at least monolatry, the worship of one God. So there's not as much of a concern about demon worship and so on. But so they can recognize that there's evil that's greater than the evil inside a person's heart or something, and that's also a force of death or of evil that is kind of on the side of these other forces of death that we can see emerge in the human body and human life, right? So all these represent in some way the forces of impurity, but also the forces of death. Okay, so is that a fair kind of picture of what's happening? So then how do we, so you've pointed out in Mark 1 how we see this happen in the Gospels, but are there other examples about Jesus's struggle with these forces of evil and death?
Yeah, so I'll talk quickly about the hemorrhaging woman of Mark 5. I always forget my biblical texts now that I have accordance software and I don't ever have to look up a text. In Mark 5, we have this story. It's actually two stories. It's what's called a Markan sandwich. Scholars call it a Markan sandwich for some reason. It doesn't feel like we're taking ourselves seriously when we do this. But a story where a man comes and says his daughter is near death. And Jesus, on the way to deal with this potential corpse, impurity, encounters a woman who has a hemorrhage. And she's had this, what most people think is a genital hemorrhage. She's had it for 12 years. It's not menstruation. It's a medical condition, but it means genital discharge has been happening for 12 years. So she's been in a state of ritual impurity for 12 years and hasn't been able to go up to the temple and take part in a full way like she'd like to, presumably, or maybe would like to, at the temple precincts. And this woman, unbeknownst to Jesus, comes up and thinks, maybe if I just touch his garment, not even his skin, but his garment, this will heal me of this condition that makes me ritually impure. And so she does. And without Jesus's permission, his body just naturally, organically heals and thus purifies this woman of this genital discharge, which then Jesus responds to. But it's a really fascinating case in Mark, and Luke has it as well in the same sort of fashion. Matthew changes it so Jesus actually gives permission, so sort of to really stress Jesus's authority. But in Mark and Luke, it's almost as though Jesus is this force of nature, and his body contains this force of nature that's shooting out purifying power into people, even upon just basic contact, even contact through the hem of the garment. Matthew turns that into, Jesus' tzitzit, these signs, very physical, evident signs of a Jewish man's sort of fidelity to Jewish law. And that's where the woman grabs onto. But we see this, Jesus doing this with this woman as well. And then he goes on right after this to this now little girl, 12-year-old girl who has turned into a corpse and raises her from the dead. So he's all three categories he sort of shows. He has control, power over these forces of impurity. And of course, the corpse is the most impure, most powerful impurity, and Jesus can overcome even that.
And if I can, so I think one of the fascinating things, you mentioned Mark 1, and early in Mark 1, we talked about this last week, Brennan and I, the impure spirit identifies Jesus as the Holy One of God.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes as Christians, we sort of mean, oh, Jesus is special. Oh, the demon recognizes that Jesus is special. But your work is suggesting something more, almost as though Jesus is the embodiment of God's holiness. And insofar as when Jesus encounters death or encounters impurity, Jesus is actually able to sort of not just deal with the symptoms of that impurity, but actually to deal with the source of that impurity. Yeah. And so I wonder, with that sort of lens, how do we make sense of the fact that the holy presence of God is coming into direct contact with a corpse, which is ritually impure, and why don't we see fireworks there, or the Chernobyl incident, or something like that? What is Mark trying to do in telling this story of the Holy One, the personification of God's holiness, coming into contact with that which is ritually impure? Yeah,
this is a great question, and I'm not entirely sure. I've thought about this for years, and I still don't feel like I have a great answer. I feel like I wish I had stressed more that this hagios tou theou is the Greek, the Holy One of God language. It potentially parallel to ton hagion, neuter word, the holy place, which often gets used of the tabernacle in the Pentateuch. And so that is where God dwells. And so maybe Mark is trying to say this is the holy place, or the Holy One of God. This is who God inhabits, embodies now here in Jesus, so that there's a parallel between the tabernacle / temple and Jesus here. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a competitive one, which is often how it gets taken. Right. Ancient people often believed gods could dwell in multiple bodies.
Right.
And could do so non-competitively. Again, Benjamin Summer does a fantastic job, I think, of showing this. And so what you're asking, Chris, though, is it seems like the rules have changed a bit, or the results have changed. If impurity goes into the temple, there are fireworks and bad things happen. And ultimately, as Ezekiel says, if it gets bad enough, God leaves and has to leave his earthly dwelling. In the person of Jesus, Mark, Matthew, and Luke have a picture of Israel's God embodied in Jesus now going to war.
Yeah, invasion is the word that came to mind. This idea of this holiness is invading the impure spaces.
Yeah. So I guess it suggests, I said God's allergic to impurity. Maybe that's a problem to say that, because maybe it's just these are the rules God has set up for the temple and tabernacle. I will leave when this happens. I don't have to. I could just destroy all these impurities and stay here. but I will leave. That's how I'm going to set up my house. And with Jesus, he's now saying, I'm going to change the rules. I'm sick of these impurities that are out there existing in the world, and I'm going to get out there and actually start cleaning them up and clean up the sources of them. The temple was never instituted. The tabernacle/temple was never instituted to destroy the sources of impurity. Priests are never given that power from God. That's just how God set up the rules of the game. We do get Elisha and Elijah doing it, mind you, but they're not priests as far as I know. You have Jesus now doing these things where he's getting to the sources of the problem, and it's sort of indebted to this larger eschatological and apocalyptic hope that Jews developed, that this sort of state of affairs is not permanent. Leviticus never tells us this. It just gives us, this is how you're supposed to go on with your daily life, given the set of conditions we live in. But Jews developed this idea of sooner or later, God's not going to let existence function just like this anymore. He's going to clean this up. And so when the gospel writers say this about Jesus, they're tapping into that larger Jewish apocalyptic view and saying, yep. And our claim is that God's doing it now in this guy in particular.
And as you point out in the book, that Ezekiel and Jeremiah both point to this new time, and when Jesus lifts up the cup of, it says, this is the cup of the new covenant. He's quoting Jeremiah chapter 31, which talks about this new time. It reminds me too of like the time in the wilderness. Let's take Exodus 25 for example, or maybe Exodus 24, when the Hebrews are in an impure state. They have been enslaved in Egypt. They have not been able to purify themselves, or they've been doing all the terrible work that they've had to do, and they haven't had time for themselves. And so, they are presumably all in an impure state. And yet, the elders are allowed to go up on the mountain with God, and it says that God used God's hand to kind of protect them in a way. There was this kind of extra, and God then sets the rules. Say, I don't want to do this all the time. I want to have a sanctuary where we have some rules and order so that I can meet with you all and be present with you. But there was this kind of like, I don't know, like there's these moments, and Elijah and Elisha, as you point out, are also these moments where like something happens. There's like this kind of extra power that changes the rules of the game. It's almost like when you read a science fiction novel and near the end, there's like a character that emerges that has all these special powers that you never knew of before. And you're like, well, you just kind of like fixed the game there, like Gandalf shows up with all the riders on the hill and you're like, wait, like, how'd you do that? But it is, it seems like there's this kind of like, there are precise moments where like God's intervention can do these things. So Jesus is one of these moments then in a way.
Yep, definitely. So yeah, it's this, I think, a really sort of fascinating narrative account of what Milgram says about forces of impurity and forces of holiness. He's personified, Mark has personified, and I think ancient Jews had personified these. That's why you get this all of a sudden explosion of the demonic. These forces of impurity and death are these personifications of impurity that are out there now wreaking havoc on earth and on humans. And God in Jewish apocalyptic thought was not going to take this for long or forever. So we see that with Jesus. This is the claim. He's doing it now. He's cleaning it up. He's sweeping up and tidying things up. And this is great news for them.
So how does this intersect with the crucifixion then? This one who was supposed to come and do all this amazing stuff ends up being, crucified as a criminal in an ignominious way, and himself suffers succumbs, it seems, right, to the forces of death. And any Roman person that you would have talked to and said like, hey, I worship this guy who had all the power of the world, and he got, by the way, executed in public by Caesar. Yeah. I mean, this would have seemed completely ridiculous. But then also within the Jewish purity system, that guy succumbed to the forces of death, right?
Right. Yeah. I'll back up just a second here. If you, like me, grew up in a church tradition which really stressed the death of Jesus, which is obviously pretty common, I always had a hard time figuring out what Jesus was doing for the first 30 or so years of his life. It seemed kind of like a waste of time. Didn't he come? I was basically taught, maybe this is a caricature and maybe this is just my own misunderstanding of what I was taught as a child. Didn't he just come to die for our sins? Well, so why, if we follow Matthew's gospel, for instance, why didn't God just let Herod kill Jesus right away? And we could have got to the good stuff. it sounded like there was sort of 30 years of Jesus killing time before he dies. And one of the things that struck me as I was beginning to see these themes in the Gospels is there's now a richer organic connection between Jesus's ministry and this view of Jesus's death as necessary, in that it's all some sort of conflict between death and impurity and holiness, Israel's God, and Jesus embodying this holiness. And so we have these initial skirmishes of Jesus with lepra or genital discharges or corpses or, moral impurities. He forgives sins in Mark 2, or impure demons, impure spirits. And the crucifixion is Jesus' death battling sort of one-on-one, the sort of culmination of this battle. Who's going to win? And it looks very much like death wins and Jesus loses, except of course, Israel's God raises Jesus from the dead. In Matthew, in a fascinating story, such an odd story, and I think we skim over the details because they don't make sense, so we just sort of let them go slide past. At the point of Jesus's death, oddly, it sounds like this force of holiness shoots out,
right,
and raises people, the saints, holy ones, from the dead, who then oddly linger in the tombs for 3 days until Jesus is raised from the dead. And then they burst out of the tombs and enter into the holy city. So there's this story dense with the imagery and the vocabulary of impurity and holiness right at the point of Jesus's death. And there's this sort of dramatic depiction of Jesus's death is actually results in death's destruction and victory of life and holiness over death.
And to take another crucifixion scene aspect of it, and which I think is related to your overall point, which is, in Mark's gospel, as Jesus exhales his last breath, it says that the veil in the temple was torn. This, as I understand it, the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the first room, the holy place. Yeah. And so what does that signify for the purity system, for the temple, for Jesus? Donald Jewell, I think, famously said that this means that like God is on the loose. God will no longer be confined to a holy of holy places. But I'm sure there's other ways to think about it, and especially with your approach to purity and impurity in the ministry of Jesus. What does the torn tabernacle suggest?
That's a good question, Chris. I don't know that I have a great answer. I know the prevalent idea is very similar to Jewel's, that there's this sort of, sometimes it's viewed as a judgment on the temple. The temple's now obsolete. Right. This whole system is gone. And I don't know that Don Jewell, I doubt he would mean it in quite that simplistic a way, given what I know about his work. But there's also the problem that it's hard to find any evidence of any Jews who thought God was only relegated to the temple in the first place.
Right.
God's maybe sort of special potent presence was there, but God's everywhere. Even Solomon, at the time that he dedicates the temple and is viewing this as sort of God's dwelling on earth, repeatedly says, "You dwell in heaven, hear us from heaven." So, ancient Jews had a very, I think, robust and what's the word here? Careful, nuanced understanding of how God could dwell in multiple places in multiple different ways. You could also look at, I think, the crucifixion as this holiness breaking forth beyond the boundaries of one flesh and blood body of just Jesus, which of course is how some of the gospel writers depict it, and that it's now going out into disciples and others. And so the boundaries of this powerful presence of God is definitely now going out expansively. But it's not
and
just
so Acts may like depict some of that, right? Like this power is now kind of moving around or something.
Yeah.
And so what do you think the authors of the Gospels, maybe even Paul, would say? Like, what does all this mean now for someone who has, belief, faith, confidence, faith, pistis, who believes in Jesus now? Like, what's the upshot at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a few things one takes away from this back then and now. One is, this is a huge claim, and it's a claim that I think should get harder every year. It's hard enough a year after Jesus has been raised from the dead. It should be harder when the gospel writers are making these claims. Paul earlier than the gospel writers. There's this claim that God has in Jesus defeated the forces of death, moral forces, spiritual forces, ritual forces, or physical sources of death. We all see the forces of death at work, and the gospel writers saw them too. But there's this claim, and that's part of this pistis, this confidence is grappling with that claim in light of what we see sort of around us. And thinking about, I think, if Jesus's mission is not just doing some random miracles and then dying for sins in sort of a courtroom setting, but is also about this destruction of death and battle against death, then if the New Testament claims in various places that Christians embody Jesus, the Holy One of God, in our temples of God, then they're also participating in this battle against the forces of death in whatever context and however those forces manifest themselves in our current situation.
And so, I love that I'm looking at their time. We're about 15 minutes left, but one of the places where we see this depiction of Jesus as going to war against death, literally, and about humanity's relationship to death is in Romans 5, a passage, that doesn't seem on the surface to have anything to do with impurity or purity, but has everything to do with the significance of Jesus's resurrection in particular, and Paul's view that that ever since Adam's first sin, and we could have a huge debate about all of that, but ever since Adam's first sin, humanity has lived in this constant state of being dominated, being ruled by death. And that one of the things that for Paul the resurrection offers is release from this. There's a new, literally a new king in town. Now that for a time, sin and death have ruled, but now grace and life are ruling. And just again, it's a fascinating telling, and so fascinating to think about it in this in the language of and in the concepts of purity and impurity. But I don't know if you have any sort of brief thoughts or not so brief thoughts about what Paul's up to in his understanding of Jesus's the resurrection as not just a one-time defeat of death, but as both something that's pointing to the end of days. He's always got that horizon in mind, but also a reality that Christians somehow experience in the present moment.
Yeah. So just going back to that category of impurity, when I talked about Milgram distinguishing between moral impurity and ritual impurity, moral impurity has to do with sin. Ritual impurity has to do ultimately with mortality.
Yeah,
that's totally, central to Paul's gospel. Life from the dead sort of can be distinguished in two senses, although they're really closely connected. There is, and you see it obviously in a passage like 1 Corinthians 15, the hope that humans will transcend in Jesus, they will transcend their mortality. That is the end result. And they've got this down payment on that via the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, this force of life invading their lives and indwelling them. And it's evidenced morally, in moral purity and removal from the forces of death that lead one into sinful behavior, which is a form of death. In Romans 5 and 6, Romans 6 and 6 through 8 are really, really nice, I think, on showing this sort of the importance of death, life, sin, righteousness. It's all this sort of closely knit together thought in Paul's mind that in Christ you get moral power via the Spirit to live a life-giving life-giving to you and through love for others.
Yeah. And it also says in Romans 6 through 8 also talks about, again, another concept that becomes really clear after a conversation is when Paul says that we're baptized into Jesus, we're sort of baptized into that holiness. If Jesus is the Holy One of God, we're sort of baptized into that life-giving set apartness. And this is why Paul in 1 Corinthians can be so concerned about what one member of that body, that Corinthian body, is doing with his body in terms of visiting a temple prostitute, and how that impurity is being brought in. But so if you're baptized into Christ, part of that is you're baptized into this holy and life-giving presence. I just think is fascinating.
Yeah, there's actually an inherent danger there, is what you're suggesting. Just like the temple, a holy place, there are regulations there that require, real care and consideration. And that's what Paul's really trying to impress upon the Corinthians. You're in this, but what you do with your bodies still matters.
Right.
And if you use them for death, bad things are going to happen. If you use them for life, then you're using that temple properly.
And is it fair to say, a lot of Christians assume that Paul says, hey, that Jewish stuff is all gone, right? But Paul's not saying that, right? Paul is a Jew. Paul's, and Paul's speaking to some people who are Jews, but mostly people who are non-Jews, but not in a way to say that stuff doesn't matter, but to say, hey, listen, what part of what Jesus does is kind of move into these different cultural spheres, not invalidating Judaism, but also kind of putting it on, and this is part of what Acts kind of says too, right? It's in a way kind of like asking other cultures to think in their own symbolic terms and own like kind of cultural terms. What are the forces of death, and how do you embody the force of life in the midst of that? Is that fair, you think?
Yeah,
or
I think that's exactly right. So Paul sort of translating this for non-Jewish audiences. They have some of the same cultural assumptions. Jews weren't the only ones who kept ritual impurity,
right?
But he's definitely translating for his audience. This is the significance of all of this for your contexts.
And we can say, every culture has our own symbols and kind of representations of life and death. But also, we it's kind of our task then to look where do we see forces of death at work in our own context. And I don't know, let's just throw this out there.
Yeah.
If we're going to be thinking about this as now we're tasked with being holy ones, people who are in some way embodying forces of life in the midst of a world that is enthralled with the forces of death. Where do we see some of these forces of death kind of emerge in our own day and age?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and super hard to answer. Obviously you can't answer it fully. It's always something that you need to think about. But one of the things that I think about, obviously we're all thinking about this pandemic and coronavirus. And I could talk very, eloquently about some of these things, but one thing that's really hit me lately in the Canadian context, and I know there's some similarities in the States, is the way in which this pandemic has affected certain populations more than others. In Canada, 80% of our deaths are in long-term care homes, which, sure, these are elderly people, many of whom may already have, underlying conditions that make this more likely. But the fact that this is happening to the weakest, most marginalized people in our world, the people that many of us think are sort of the most useless and expendable, suggests that we are not caring, and we are not, as a culture of life. The long-term cares in Canada where we've seen the greatest death are the for-profit ones, not the government-run ones or the non-profit ones. That's where the highest percentages of deaths are happening, and where we've put profits over people. And that is a force of death, quite a physical force of death that is attached very clearly to other material conditions. We've heard numerous pieces of evidence that racialized minorities are also dying, contracting and dying of COVID at higher rates than white people both in the States and in Canada. This says there's a culture of death around race, and obviously racism is a much larger conversation, but this is one way I think it inflects in our world and day.
Bill Brown, who's a colleague of mine at Columbia Seminary, wrote a little bit about how this is an apocalypse, not an end of the world as a lot of people take it, but an unveiling or a revealing, an unveiling of truths that underlie our world. And that one of those is that, that when you look at these increased mortality rates, they're linked to all kinds of other systemic issues that are often hidden from particular people's points of view. For example, mine as a white cis male Christian, I'm the person who kind of is designed, like these filters are designed to filter out a world that I don't want to engage. Yeah. To me, that's like representative of the forces of death. This kind of the filter, the matrix, which keeps me from encountering difference, otherness, but also to see the kind of effects of our economy and our global system, but also our system of racial hierarchy and gender hierarchy and so on, which is revealed in this pandemic in ways that are shocking. But also equally shocking is the fact that we just don't recognize, like how many public recognitions have there been of like COVID? Yeah. I mean, at least in the States, it's been papered over in so many ways. But in any event, Chris, what do you think?
Well, so I have two thoughts. One is not the U.S. context, but my son is a big soccer player, and as we were driving up to his game yesterday, I was talking with him about. It was revealed last week that like between like 5,000 and 6,000 migrant workers have died getting ready for the World Cup in Qatar, and wow. And just I don't know what to call that as a label of. Forces of death, but just the reality that that unfortunately we still live in an age where certain lives are expendable and certain lives are more worthy of protection. And the fact that in however many months the whole world is going to enjoy and really profit from the death of these migrant workers as we watch soccer on the world scale, the worldwide stage, and it just. Again, Lent is a time of repentance. It's a time of lament, and that example for me just crystallizes the way in which I need to evaluate how I participate in these systems. That if they're not directly leading to death, they are at least uninterested in prolonging life. And how that is, and to lament that reality, to lament the reality that, I feel like my hands are tied. I'm not a FIFA, bureaucrat or, administrator. I just like to watch soccer with my son. And so that's one thought that I have about this forces of life. The other one that I think is really important for Lent, and for Christian circles is, we often, it's easy, Matt, it sounds like you and I were brought up in similar contexts. Jesus came to die so that we could have eternal life. And there's this sort of mode of Christian existence, which is, I'm just waiting to get hit by a bus, go up to be with Jesus in the eternal life. And what our conversation today has really reinforced is the life of discipleship is the life of promoting life, and working to establish systems of life, and not just a hope of eternal life, but that we individually would perhaps have life, but also that we would make decisions, that we would vote, we would work for changes that do in fact promote life. And I think that has really clear, implications that would take us pretty far asunder in our conversation, but just hearing our conversation just strikes me as a place to go. Not just eternal life, but life in the now, and not just my life, but also the life of others around me. So that's what I would say. And of course, it's now 10:29, so you guys can't say how stupid I am, which is great. Matt, I'm thinking if before we leave, I'm thinking that our conversation today has made people say, I might try to read Leviticus again. Wow. And I'm really interested in Jacob Milgram's work, but I know enough to know that Jacob Milgram has written enough for a small bedroom, and some of it is quite technical and hard. So if there was one, because I know it's from reading your book, I know that you've been influenced by Milgram's approach to Leviticus and Numbers. And so if there was one book or even one article by Milgram that you would say, if you want to understand this world, go here. Is there a recommendation there?
Yeah, so he wrote a 3-volume commentary on Leviticus. That's got to be about that big. But he also wrote a condensed commentary in the Continental Commentary series on Leviticus, put out by Fortress Press, I think. That is a great sort of overview of Leviticus. It's not like the smoothest reading because it's a commentary, but you get lots of the sort of snippets of stuff to help you understand what's going on in the text of Leviticus.
Okay.
And if you want a really short introduction, I can post this, but it's Jonathan Klawans wrote in the Jewish Study Bible a little article, like 5 pages, called Concepts of Purity. And that might be like a first place to start, Concepts of Purity in the Bible, in the Jewish Study Bible, that is edited by Adele Berlin and Mark C. Brettler. But that might be a place, like, like 2 pages, but then you graduate to the Jacob Milgram course. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, I think, we're just about at time. Brennan, Matt, thank you for the conversation. Brennan, next week, we're talking again, another sort of consequence of Jesus and the cross is how Jesus engages the powers and the principalities. And so we're going to read Colossians 1 and Romans 8 as our sort of focus text. There's some additional resources. And you and I will be in conversation next week at 9:30. That's right.
So we can pick up on this point of like the root causes of death and the powers of death and so on, and think about how Paul and post-Paul thinkers are engaging some of these questions that are raised by Jesus's death and resurrection. That'd be great. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. That was really fun and enlightening. And by the way, Jesus and the Forces of Death, available from Baylor University Press. And we will look forward, and we'll look forward to talking to Beverly Gaventa about Romans later too, about some of this stuff about life and holiness too. All right, thanks y'all.
Peace. Thanks for having me.